Hey everyone! If this happened to you, would you confront the person directly or cut them out and move on? Comment confront or move on. And tell us why. Now, let's hear what happened. I stood in the driveway of my childhood home, watching as a matte gray delivery van rolled up, the screech of its brakes breaking through the chatter and clink of dishes at the backyard brunch. My dad, Carl, threw down his BBQ tongs, a frown furrowing his brow, as napkins and paper plates flew off the folding table. My mom, Dana, clutched her wine glass, her face twisted in confusion, while Tyler's boast about his bonus check faltered mid-sentence. The van doors swung open with mechanical precision, and a man in a dark uniform stepped out, walking straight toward me. He didn't hesitate. "Ellis," he said, his voice clipped, "wheels up in 90 seconds." I nodded at my dad, trying to keep my voice even. "Deliveries for me." Without waiting for a response, I turned and walked into the van, not sparing a glance behind me. I heard my mom gasp, the shock in her voice cutting through the tense silence. My dad's yelling followed, some incoherent string of words, but the van doors closed before I could make out any of it. I was sealed in, and they were out. 2 nights earlier, I sat through dinner at a stuffy restaurant, celebrating Tyler's promotion to market expansion lead at some mid-tier logistics company. My dad, beaming like he'd just won a lottery, went on about how Tyler's job has real impact, as if he was a goddamn CEO. Tyler, of course, was more than happy to validate that by bragging about managing 4 regional teams and getting a company Tesla. My mom nodded, her smile tight as always, like she was trying to keep up with the whole thing. I barely touched my food. Eventually, Dad turned to me, that smug smirk on his face. "Still processing insurance claims, Ellie? Hope they let you leave the cubicle for lunch?" Tyler snorted. My mom gave her usual pained smile, but it didn't even reach her eyes. I didn't react. I'd learned a long time ago not to let them get to me. But I could feel Vince Carraway shift beside me, soft-spoken logistics consultant that my family barely noticed. His eyes flicked to me, then quickly away, like he was trying to pretend it hadn't happened. I knew what that glance meant. The room hadn't just turned awkward, my cover had been compromised. I straightened up, trying to ignore the weight of Vince's gaze. He didn't say anything, but I could tell he was processing. 3 weeks ago, Vince had been in the war room with me, analyzing troop movements and economic choke points for an allied nation. He knew exactly what I was doing, but my family? They never asked. They wouldn't have understood. They didn't care. "Tyler's doing great," Dad went on, oblivious to the tension. "Ellie's just, stable." I almost didn't hear the last part. It didn't matter. I had heard it 1,000 times before. It was always the same. Tyler was the golden child, the one with the real job, the one who was always making moves. And I was just the one who processed claims, worked behind the scenes, out of sight. Safe. Boring. I looked over at Vince again, just long enough to catch his eye. His expression was unreadable, but I knew what he saw. The gap between what they thought and what I actually did. I knew he knew. That brief glance had been everything. He saw me, not the version of me that was buried under layers of family expectations, not the one that filed reports or played it safe, the real me. The one who sat in rooms where decisions changed the course of history, where data was life or death. "Ellie," Dad said, breaking the silence, "you should come visit Tyler at the office sometime. Get some real-world experience." I wanted to laugh, but I didn't. "Maybe," I said, keeping it casual, but my mind was already elsewhere. Vince's words, my past life, it all felt like it was closing in. The cover I'd carefully built for years had cracked, and once that happened, there was no going back. Tyler launched into another story about his latest corporate conquest, but I wasn't listening. My gaze shifted to the rest of the table. Mom, as usual, was trying to smooth things over with a nervous laugh, but I saw the subtle tension in her shoulders, the way she tried to mask her discomfort. She wasn't as oblivious as Dad, but she wouldn't ever confront it, not with Tyler's success overshadowing everything else. And then there was Vince, sitting there, quiet, aware. He wasn't playing this game. He wasn't pretending. As I forced a smile and nodded along to their conversation, I realized the truth. My family had no idea who I was. Not really. And they never would. But Vince knew. I think back to all the quiet ways they'd erased me, all the things they chose not to remember. Like the time I won the spelling bee in 4th grade. It should have been a victory lap, but my dad had forgotten by the next day. Or when I made Dean's List in college, they barely acknowledged it. The year I worked nights to finish grad school, not a word. But Tyler, he couldn't do anything wrong. My dad hung his middle school most improved plaque like it was a Nobel Prize. It was still there, in the hallway, shiny and framed. Me? The year I published my thesis, my dad tossed it in a drawer. He never even read it. Once I'd tried to show him a complex supply chain model I'd built for a federal exercise, a real-world simulation, top-tier stuff. He patted my head like I was some kid, asked if I'd seen Tyler's new espresso machine. Mom? She once told a neighbor, Ellie's job is less visible, but she likes routine. That was the narrative they'd built about me. I was the stable one, the boring one, the one who probably wore loafers by choice. And I played into it. I let them think that's all I was. But they didn't know Ellie wasn't me. It was the alias. The real me worked for a private global risk analysis firm, contracted by intelligence agencies. I was far from stable, far from boring. I was part of the teams that did things that made history, things my family would never understand, things that could ruin them if they knew. They still thought I sat in some cubicle, processing insurance claims. They thought my life was small, safe. They couldn't have been more wrong. I used to think maybe I'd tell them one day, just sit down and explain everything. The real work, the high-stakes operations. Maybe they'd finally understand. But that thought always seemed more like a fantasy than a possibility. There was too much at stake, and they didn't even have the capacity to comprehend it. How could they when they couldn't even be bothered to read my thesis? I've learned not to waste my breath on explanations. They'd always see me as Ellie, the quiet, routine one, and I'd always be that for them. It's easier that way, safer. But then there's Vince, and that quick glance he gave me at dinner. That look that said he saw it all. The divide between my family's version of me and the reality they'd never know. It wasn't just awkward. It was a crack in the wall I'd built between myself and them, a crack that would never heal. I'm not sure what to do with that. I remember leading the multi-agency simulation like it was yesterday, the kind of session where every detail mattered. Senior advisors sat in a room full of data analysts, military planners, and a handful of execs, all scrutinizing the outcome of an energy crisis that spanned 3 continents. The stakes were real. The brief was high level, but the consequences were anything but abstract. I laid out my model, a detailed projection of energy shortages, the geopolitical fallout, and the economic collapse that could trigger a regional war. I showed how the blackouts would destabilize global markets and collapse local governments. The numbers were solid. The scenario I'd constructed was airtight. Then, one older exec leaned forward, eyebrow raised, and interrupted. That's a strong conclusion, but based on what? Before I could answer, I felt the tension in the room. They were waiting for me to justify myself. But Director Lawton, my boss, didn't let it hang for long. Her model predicted the Andean pipeline blackout with 97% accuracy, Lawton said, his voice cutting through the noise. Let her finish. The room went quiet. I nodded, but I didn't need to say much more. My model spoke for itself. I wasn't some analyst sitting behind a desk, moving numbers around for fun. In this world, there was no room for error. In their world, there were bonus points for good presentations and clever quips. But in mine, mistakes didn't just cost money or prestige. They cost lives. I finished the presentation in full, laying out how the collapse of energy infrastructure would roll through the political, economic, and military systems of 3 key nations. How a tiny ripple could turn into a full-scale crisis. The room was still when I finished, not because they didn't understand it, but because they did, and they knew I was right. As I wrapped it up, I could almost feel the weight of the difference between my world and the one my family thought I lived in. For them, success was a bonus check or a new car. For me, success meant making sure the world didn't fall apart, and the line between the two had never felt wider. After the simulation ended, I stayed behind to debrief with a few senior analysts. My mind was still on the dinner from 2 nights ago, on how my family saw me as nothing more than a stable one, the boring one in the cubicle. The contrast between what I was doing and what they thought I did became even starker in that moment. They didn't even know what real stakes look like. And now, after Vince's look at dinner, after everything that happened there, I realized how far apart I really was from them. I was working in a world of predictions, where the wrong move could mean the collapse of a country or the loss of thousands of lives. But they were still stuck thinking I was just doing routine work, like it was all paperwork and office politics. That disconnect was always there, but now it was louder and more dangerous. I filed the breach report late that night. It was nothing major, just a low-level breach. My father's careless remarks during dinner, his sloppy chatter in front of a partially cleared contact. It wasn't personal, it was just protocol. Keeping my world and theirs separate meant making sure the lines were always clear. And that meant reporting things like this, no matter how insignificant they seemed. Lawton's face was unreadable during the secure video call, just a shadow of his usual stern self. "You'll be at the family house this weekend," he said, his voice even, detached. "We've updated your location." I nodded without hesitation, but my mind was elsewhere. I wasn't going to explain barbecues and brunches to a man who once ran risk audits in 2 failed states. He wouldn't understand the point of it. Hell, he wouldn't care. In his world, the stakes were always immediate, always high. Every second counted. There was no room for distractions. The operation, internal name, Sandlock, was hitting a critical juncture. It was reaching a pivot point. I'd stayed mobile for weeks, always one step ahead of whatever came next. I didn't have the luxury of being static, of slipping back into old routines, not even for my family. I clicked off the video call and turned back to the dim glow of my laptop screen. The walls of my childhood bedroom felt closer than ever. The pastel wallpaper faded from years of neglect, and the old volleyball trophies sitting in the corner, they were all still there, like nothing had ever changed. My old life still hung on the walls, while the rest of me had moved on to a world that had no place for past comforts. I opened the emergency extraction protocols and flagged the house as an active pickup point. It was just a precaution, but if something went wrong, if Sandlock's operational status shifted, or if I needed to move fast, this was where I'd be extracted from. The protocols were in place, and I wasn't about to take chances. I needed to stay responsive, even in the most familiar of places. I closed the file and shut the laptop. The click of the lid was a finality. It was an acknowledgement that this world, the one with the family, the dinners, the quiet routine, had no bearing on what I was doing now. There was no room for sentiment, only results. I'd been balancing both worlds for years, but there were days like today when the divide between them seemed impossibly wide. I stood up from my desk and glanced around the room. It was still my childhood space, but it felt foreign now. The real work didn't happen here. My real job, the one that mattered, was out there, on the other side of everything my family would ever understand. I exhaled slowly, making sure my mind was clear. Then, I moved. The world outside was waiting for me, and it wasn't going to wait much longer. Saturday rolled in like any other suburban afternoon. Tyler was giving his usual spiel about his team hitting their quarterly numbers. The neighbor kids bounced around on a rented inflatable obstacle course, shrieking like it was the greatest day of their lives. My dad, of course, had taken the chance to hold court by the grill, bragging about a local award he'd received for outstanding civic contribution. The whole scene was exactly what I expected. The same suburban show of success, of achievement, of normal. I sat on the porch sipping lemon water, keeping quiet. I wasn't here to participate in the charade. Instead, I was scanning my muted smartwatch, scrolling through news feeds, catching up on intel that could have been life or death, depending on where I was needed next. There were no light conversations here, no casual, "How's work?" Just data, a constant stream of alerts, analysis, and updates. In my world, information was always coming in, always shifting. Then I felt it. A faint buzz in my wrist, so subtle it could have been a muscle twitch. But I knew what it was. The screen lit up, bright against the soft light of the afternoon. Evil Redlock, Stage 2, initiated, transport en route. My pulse didn't skip. It didn't falter. It didn't need to. I'd been waiting for this. I set the glass down carefully, not looking back at the scene behind me. The sound of Tyler's laugh, my dad's voice booming about some ridiculous civic nonsense. It all faded as I stood up, pushing the chair back with a quiet scrape. I didn't hesitate as I walked inside. There was no time to explain or to justify. I didn't owe them that. The house felt smaller as I moved through it, every step reminding me of how far I'd come from this place. I grabbed my go bag from the bedroom, the one that had been sitting in the corner since the last time I'd needed it. It was heavier now. It had everything I'd need, a few essentials, a couple of things I could never afford to leave behind. I paused just for a moment at the door, scanning the room one last time. The walls still had that faded pastel touch, the same stupid volleyball trophies. Nothing about this house had changed, but I didn't say goodbye. There was nothing to say. I swung the bag over my shoulder and walked out, stepping back onto the porch, ignoring the soft voices drifting through the yard. My family had no idea what was about to happen. They wouldn't understand, and I wasn't about to explain it to them now. The transport was en route. The mission had shifted, and I had to be ready. And for the first time in a long while, I felt the separation between the two worlds. The one I left behind on this porch and the one that was calling me forward. The van pulled up fast, unmarked, matte gray, its reinforced side panels barely making a sound against the pavement. At first, no one noticed. The chatter at the barbecue was too loud, too mindless. My dad was in his element, talking about the lawn or some half-baked neighborhood improvements. But then the brakes screeched, and the air vents roared, blasting napkins and paper plates off the folding tables. My dad froze, his mouth half open, staring at the chaos unfolding. Then he started yelling about the lawn and the hedges, always the damn hedges. Tyler looked around, confused, still clutching his glass of wine. But I could tell something was off. His smile faltered. The doors of the van swung open with a sharp mechanical hiss. A man in full tactical gear stepped out, his movements fluid and deliberate. He walked toward me without hesitation. Echo 7 confirmed. "You're clear," he said, his voice flat, official. The party went dead silent. No one knew what was happening, but everyone knew it was bad. The quiet stretched too long, like everyone was holding their breath, waiting for someone to make sense of this. My dad wasn't waiting. His voice cut through the silence like a knife. "What the hell is this?" he shouted, his face flushed with anger. "You can't just show up at my house!" The man didn't respond. He ignored my father completely, his eyes already fixed on me. His gaze was unwavering. "Ellis," he said, blunt and to the point, "wheels up in 90 seconds. I didn't flinch. I didn't hesitate. I stood and walked calmly toward the van, even as the whispers started. Not just from my parents, but from the relatives who had pulled out their phones, capturing every second of this meltdown. I heard my mother gasp, her wine glass slipping from her hand. It shattered on the concrete, but I didn't stop walking. I wasn't about to look back at the wreckage. This wasn't their world anymore. It never had been. "Ellie, hold on," my dad shouted, his voice cracking now. "You think you're better than us? You think this means something?" I turned once, just enough to see his face. His eyes were wide, but not with understanding. Number. It was rage, a desperate, panicked anger, like he was losing control of something he thought he had a grip on. I nodded. It wasn't an apology, it wasn't an explanation. It was a silent acknowledgement of everything I had walked away from and everything I was leaving behind. But I didn't owe him any more than that. Then I stepped into the van, the doors closing with a soft hiss behind me. He didn't understand what had just happened. He never would, and I wasn't going to waste any more time trying to make him. Inside the van, I didn't look back at the house. I didn't need to. The only thing that mattered was the task ahead. I pulled out the tablet mounted to the side of the van and logged into the secured network before we'd even left the neighborhood. The operation was live, Redlock was in motion. My predictions had been spot on. The situation had escalated exactly the way we'd anticipated. There was no time to feel anything about it. No time to think about what I'd just left behind. The people in the van didn't care about my family. They didn't ask questions. They didn't ask why I looked calm or why I didn't seem to be shaken. They didn't need to. All they needed from me was focus, precision, and the ability to move without hesitation. It wasn't personal. It wasn't about me. It was about the mission. I reviewed the incoming data, flagged a few items for escalation, and sent out some immediate updates. The systems ran like clockwork, but the real work was happening in my head, where I processed patterns and contingencies faster than anyone else in that van could see them. Days later, I found myself in a secure facility, briefing military liaisons and analysts, laying out next step recommendations for the operation. The room was quiet, everyone listening intently. I wasn't Ellie anymore. I wasn't the girl who sat in the background at family dinners. Director Lawton spoke up, his voice carrying the kind of weight that made everyone pay attention. "Ellis has the updated strategy," he said, his gaze shifting to me as he spoke. "She'll brief the ambassador directly." It was a simple statement, but it was the first time anyone had referred to me by my real name, not my alias. For the first time in what felt like a long time, I felt like I belonged. I wasn't just Ellie. I wasn't just the stable one, the one who played it safe. In this room, with these people, I was the one with the answers. The one who could turn data into outcomes. The one who made sure the world didn't fall apart. No one interrupted me this time. No one asked me to justify myself. And for the first time, I didn't have to explain anything. I was exactly where I was supposed to be. A few weeks later, I met my team at our usual spot, a dim bar with no TVs and stiff drinks. It was a place where no one cared about appearances. We didn't toast bonuses or new cars. We toasted each other's judgment, our instincts, the kind of things that kept us alive when things went wrong. Marcus, a field agent who I'd once rerouted away from an ambush, raised his beer and looked at me with a grin. To Ellis, glad you don't work insurance. The whole table burst into laughter. Even I laughed, real this time. Not the kind of fake chuckles I'd thrown around my family for years. This wasn't an act. I belonged here. I belonged with them. It felt good to laugh like that, to let go of the weight of the worlds I juggled daily. They got it. They understood what was at stake, and they trusted me in a way I could never expect from the people who had raised me. A week later, I got a text from my dad. One line, "We didn't know." I stared at it for a long time. My finger hovered over the reply button, but I didn't type anything. I couldn't. There was nothing to explain. The gulf between us had only grown wider, and no number of texts or apologies would ever close it. So I archived the message without responding. I couldn't afford distractions. On my desk, a photo of my team caught mid-laugh. The kind of genuine smile I hadn't shared in years sat next to my terminal. It was the only picture I needed, the only one that mattered. I turned back to my work, new patterns to analyze, new data to make sense of. The real work never stopped, and neither did I.